Hey, it's Mosquito, also known as Chris. Welcome to the shop. Today we are going to look at yet another form of CNC box. This one is a mitered box. The mitered corner is there, and I did all of it on the CNC machine with the exception of cutting the top off to make the lid. A little bit of an overview of the box here. I glued this whole box up like this, and then I cut it here with the bandsaw. You need a 90-degree V-bit because we are going to be doing the miter with the 90-degree V-bit. And the thing is that it needs to be as wide as your stock is thick at a minimum. As a result, I'm using 3/8 inch material, and I have a 7/8 inch thick 90-degree V-bit that I'll be using. That allows me to get this all the way down in one cut. Next thing is I use an 1/8 inch bit for the rest of it, just a standard straight end mill. And so that does the groove here, the groove on the top side for the lid, and then that also does the whole groove for our spline for the lid. The last thing is it comes in and hogs out this pocket here, and that is where our square spline goes. That gets glued in there between the side and the end. So this actually sits somewhere in this box like this. If it was a piece that was here, then both side and the end would be this thick. So we can see how our miter meets here, and then we've got our square dowel, and then this piece and that piece would normally touch for the rest of the box. And that is how this thing is put together. Last year, with the CNC group through the Minnesota Woodworkers Guild, we were part of a project where we supplied boxes for kind of a burial ceremony for families that experienced neonatal loss. We are doing that again this year, and I'm trying a different box this time. Last year, I did those blind finger joint boxes. You can go check that one out if you haven't already seen it. So if that's something that interests you, then let's dive into kind of a little back and forth between the CNC and the actual design of this thing. So we'll jump into CAD first, kind of get an intro to the model, and then I'll kind of walk through the pieces as I go through it on the CNC machine, and we can go from there. Just to give an overview, this is clearly the box. It's got this raised panel, which I actually won't be doing in this video, but it's pretty simple. All you end up doing is just putting a chamfer on a thicker top piece than what I'm going to be using. I'm going to be using 1/4 inch because I wanted it to be flush. But if you wanted to have a raised panel, go for it. It's really not that hard. You just add thicker top board and a bigger chamfer, or a chamfer, I guess, on the top. And I like to have an assembly where I put everything together so I can kind of visualize and make sure things are going to fit the way I expect them to. So let's dive into this section analysis here. Here you can see how the box is assembled. Grooves for the bottom panel, the grooves for the top panel, and then this rabbet. I only have it on the side panels, or the long sides for mine, and I'm calling those the sides, and then I'm calling the short ones the ends. If I was more worried about the fit, I would probably put that same groove all the way around and also include it on the end. But these are single-use boxes, and they're not really going to matter that much. So for this, I'm just doing the front and the back to save a little bit on material and a little bit on time. So now we can kind of see that raised panel, and if we get into the corner joinery here, we can see how we've got our mitered corner. So if I went up closer to the top, we'll see how that mitered corner closes up, and then down below the groove of the lid is where we start adding that spline. So we've got a square spline here, and then we can see that it's mitered before and after that, and then we can kind of keep going all the way down to the bottom, and then we'll see the same exact thing. That is enough of that. Let's dive into the first part, which is going to be cutting out long side and the short side. On our long side, we can see how I've got it modeled here. So we've got the miter, and we've got this knockout here for where that square spline is going to be, and then we've got our 3 grooves, and everything is set up to the same size. Parametrically, I have a bunch of things in here. So the stock thickness, so what I'm using, the length of the box that I want. Right now I have it actually set up for the larger box, which I'm actually making a smaller box in this video, so we'll just kind of ignore that piece of it. And then the height, and now my spline thickness. So that is that square dowel. I'm assuming it's square. The groove thickness, that is the width for the top and bottom panel, and I have mine set to 0.126 because I'm using a 1/8 inch bit, which is 0.125, and having the 0.126 gives it just enough clearance that it's not going to complain about I can't do that groove, and I just kind of like being able to clean up both sides. The spline offset, so right now 8 is 1/16 of an inch, and that is the distance between these two things. And that is the distance for our spline offset. And that's just so I can control where exactly that square spline ends up in the corner. So I tend to favor it towards the inside of the box more than the outside, just because that leaves thicker material on the outside for better gluing up there where you're actually going to see it. And on the inside, I wanted something because I don't want that square dowel showing inside the box, but I didn't feel like I needed to have a ton of it since it's already thick there to begin with. The next thing I have here is the splitting kerf, and that is actually just something that basically gets added to the height of the box, because that is what I expected to use for splitting it. I was planning on having it split on the table saw, but I ended up using the bandsaw here, which I basically just ended up making 2 passes and cutting it out in the middle. But that adds it in here, and then it adds it to the overall height. And then we've got the lid groove width, which is this wide one here. That is 7/8 in my case, and the lid groove depth is 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to use 1/8 inch material for the actual spline thickness. So that's what this is here. And that is pretty much all I have set up. And then the lids are really nothing special. It's basically just whatever my material thickness is for the top, which I was using the same thickness before. Like I said, I modified that to be 1/4 inch just because I didn't want the actual beveled tops on these particular boxes. But yeah, it's basically just a flat sheet with a rabbet all the way around these sides, and then I modeled in these beveled corners. Really, you don't need to. You can just do that completely in the toolpath by using like a chamfer, and you don't have to actually model this in place. I just do for the visual because I like it to be able to see what I'm doing. Or copy the top lid to make the bottom, and then I just put on a really small chamfer that I basically ignored in this box. But so I've got an assembly, and what I do is I've actually drawn this here. So there's actually a box. If I looked at that assembly, and we go back to here. So I have a sketch, and that is the length plus the width plus 0.2. I could put them closer together if you wanted to figure out and calculate exactly what your width would be when your V-bit cuts through. So if you wanted to do that, you certainly could. This is easier because I don't have to worry about getting that exactly right and getting the depth and the width. So I've just let them both cut and don't have to worry about that. So that's what this is, the length of a long side, and the width is the length of a short side, and then the 0.2 just to have a little bit of space when I'm doing that V-bit. I line up my models here on the corner, and that gives me the ability to then, when I'm cutting these shapes out, I just have it do a contour on this line, and then I do the same thing on the other side. So rather than going back and forth and cutting out this piece, and then back and forth and cutting out this piece, I just have it go all the way across. And if I was going to be trying to aim for maximum efficiency, I would probably put another sketch, a couple sketch lines for the 2 grooves, so that way I could do the 2 grooves together at the same time as well, and just have that groove go all the way back and forth. But I didn't feel like going through the headache of setting all that up for this. But if you feel like it, go for it. We'll go over to the manufacture tab, and right now I am in half sides. So I called it half sides because this is half the sides. I'm using those machine assemblies as my models. So I'll turn off the lids for now, and we will dive into some of this. The first thing I have is I call it 1-inch chamfer, but I think technically mine is a 7/8 inch. I can't remember. I'm using a trace, and what I'm using for my geometry is that very, very edge at the bottom, and I have it set up to do the trace right on it. I'm not really concerned about, is this going to be exact, or do I need to do an offset for the... I'm not worried about that. I have it set to go both directions, because in both ends, like 3 of the 4 cuts, I'm going back and forth, and it's going to be a full width cut. So I'm not too concerned about the direction of cut. It's going to be fully engaged both ways, so it's not really a climb or a traditional standard cut. So it is what it is. Like, it's going full width, so it's got even load on both sides, so I'm not too concerned about it. Then I just have multiple steps at 0.04 inches, because the beginning you don't really need that. If there's a way to do progressive step downs, that would actually be interesting. Like, if I could have an 1/8 of an inch, and then like a 1/16 of an inch, and then a 32nd of an inch, and then something like that. Because the deeper down you get, the wider the cut's going to be, the much more load you're going to have on it. And then the last thing to note is I also have a pass extension of 1/8 of an inch. So that is how far it is beyond both sides. So I just want to make sure that this corner is nice and clean, so I go beyond both of them. There's a lot of caveats here. I'm kind of hesitant on telling you what my feeds and speeds are, just because your material might be different. I'm using poplar, your machine might be different, Your bit might be different. I have a spindle, you might not. There's a lot of things that go into what you need to figure out for your machine that might be different. So anyway, I'm running it at 20,000 on my spindle, and then my feed rate for cutting is 80. So 80 inches per minute is what I'm cutting with my V-bit. I found a pretty good speed for that 0.04 inch depth of cut. The free version is going to cap you at this 80 inches per minute cutting rate. So if you have something that's jumping all over the place, you're going to pay a big penalty when it has to go across. So it's sort of like this balance. If you're going for efficiency and you're using the free version, you're going to have to sort of balance out, do I try to take a lighter cut and go faster? Or do I try to take a heavier cut and get it done in fewer passes? And there's trade-offs there where you might want to look at, okay, am I going to be doing a lot of rapids? Is it going to be doing a lot of non-cutting operations? Is it going to be moving around a lot without cutting? And in that case, you might want to see the effect of increasing the cut speed and decreasing the depth of cut. So you might make more than one pass, but if you're doing a lot of jumping around, then it might help you speed up some of the rapid movements. So that's just some things to consider. And that's why I have this cutting both ways, is because then rather than coming down and then lifting, going back over, going back down, cutting, lifting, it just cuts back and forth, and it effectively cuts the time in half because it's cutting the entire time instead of half the time. And so that's why I separate all four of these, is to make it so that it's only going back and forth, and then it moves to the next groove once. I don't know that that's a problem with the trace function. It might not be. It might try to do all the way depth. I didn't actually try, but that is what I do. You have to separate because you don't get tool changes on the free version either. So I have one folder set up for my chamfer bit and then one for the 1/8 inch. So that is the first operation, is running the chamfer bit. So that is all four of those operations, and we will jump over that quick. We are over here at the CNC. We're getting set up for the first cut, and the first thing that we start with is this 90-degree V-bit. This one is 7/8 of an inch diameter for the cut, and the important thing to note about that is because this is 45 degrees and that's half of the cutting width, we know that it's going to be, what, 7/16 if it's 7/8. So that is the farthest point up to where it stops cutting 45 degrees. So 7/16 is the maximum thickness that I can do, or you'll have this little step, and that's probably not what you want for this process. I've got double-sided carpet tape. It just comes in a roll with the backing on it. I like the stuff with like the cotton mesh or whatever that is in it. I think it holds a little bit better. I think it's usually marketed as like heavy traffic or indoor outdoor, not the light traffic stuff. The light traffic stuff is just basically the film, and I don't think that sticks as well. So I butt that up against my two stops and then move it over to the one on the end and then give it a good push down. And because I'm not actually cutting all the way to the edge, I can also throw down some hold downs on it. The carpet tape is kind of there just so that I don't have to worry about using a bunch of tabs and stuff, because it's just a little bit faster if I don't have to clean up tabs. I just have to peel off the paper and go. And so this is just kind of the way that I prefer to do it, because I just find it works a little bit better for me. We are going to be starting with that V-bit, which cuts a fairly wide cut. And that is going to be going back and forth all the way across, or very close to it. So if you're setting up stops like this, do a bunch of them. Make sure that none of your stops are in places where you're going to hit it with that V-bit, because ouch. All right, that was the 90-degree V-bit. And now, while I do this bit change, I'm going to be putting in an 1/8 inch bit, kind of a roughing bit. Well, not kind of, it is a roughing bit. So it's got all these serrations on the sides, and that helps reduce the chip size. And it just kind of makes it a little bit better for the rough clearing of stuff, because you can push it a little bit harder. The downside to that, obviously, is that it is going to be not quite as smooth of a finish. So if you need a perfectly smooth finish, you're going to want to use something else. So I started with the 90-degree V-bit, and the reason for that is because this is going to have a bunch of grooves that this creates. So if I do all these grooves with the 1/8 inch bit first, and then come back to the 90-degree V-bit, it just blows out a lot of those, and I don't want that to happen. So I choose to do the V-bit first. I also like throwing my wrench across the room. I do the V-bit first, and that avoids all of that tear out and just keeps things a little bit nicer. And now coming back to our 1/8 inch stuff. So now I'm running the 1/8 inch, and most of these are going to be running at about 200 inches a minute. So 200 inches, 20,000 RPM, and then I have the ramp feed rate and the plunge rate at 80, just to slow it down a little bit on entry and then just let that thing rip. For the grooves, I do these again one at a time just to make sure that it basically does it in one spot, finishes it, moves on to the next one. And so I've just got the pocket for the top groove. So this is my top long groove. And then for my passes, I'm doing the same sort of a thing. So I'm doing roughing step down of 0.05 inches. And then I'm not doing any stock to leave, and I'm not doing any finishing passes just because, again, these are all internal things. So I'm just letting the thing rip, let it chew through it, and be done. And that's pretty much all it is. And I don't have both ways turned on for this, because in this case, it doesn't really matter, because it's going to go down one way, move over that 0.001 of an inch, and then come back. So it's basically cleaning up both sides all the way around. So it is effectively cutting both sides all the way down. And then after that, I just do the exact same thing where I have it do the long groove. So same thing, I'm just doing a pocket, having it clear all that out. Same feeds and speeds, everything, step downs. We go to the short groove at the top, and then go to the long groove at the bottom, and then we do the short groove on the bottom. And now we start getting into the splines. So this, I have that flat section here. And for this one, I'm doing a pocket. Same cutting parameters, 280. And then for passes, this one I do a little bit different. So I have the maximum roughing step down is 1/4 of an inch. So basically it'll come down 1/4 of an inch. And the reason for that is because more than half of this material is already gone, because it's basically starting from the top of the stock, not knowing that we've already gotten rid of all of this. And I could do rest machining in, set all that kind of stuff up, but it's a lot of overkill that I just didn't feel like I needed. So maximum roughing step down of 1/4 of an inch. It'll hog out a lot of that material, but then I have my maximum step over set to basically 1/16 of an inch, so 0.06. So it's not taking off a lot of width, and this roughing bit could take off basically 1/8 of an inch at 1/8 of an inch depth. Like, it's no problem with that. So this is a pretty light cut, all things considered, but this lets me get down into actually cutting wood faster rather than doing shallower passes where I would end up doing like I think I calculated it out, I would have been doing 5 passes back and forth without actually cutting anything before it got to a point where it was actually touching wood. And this just basically eliminates down to 1. So it makes fewer passes at a deeper cut and takes care of that faster. I do the far right, since we finished with that bottom groove, we'll be over here already. So I do this one, and then we move on to the next one. We move on to the next one, moving on to the last one. And then now I do the contours, and this is the top contour. So if you remember that sketch from the beginning, if we dig into that one, my geometry is that whole sketch line. So it just cuts the whole side following the same thing as those grooves. We're 0.125, so 1/8 of an inch depth of cut. Bottom side, I didn't use grooves because I'm using double-sided tape. And yeah, let's see that get set up, and we will let that one run. All right, now we're moving on to lids. And again, this is a little bit wonky because in my situation, I actually had the setup for this was actually using a thinner material. Basically, if I set this to our 0.25 inches, it's going to yell at you saying that the Z height is less than the selected model. I am okay with that because I know what I'm doing, or I pretend. I have it do the rabbit. So I just have a pocketing operation for this face here, 80, 200, 20,000 RPM. Our geometry is just that pocket. So I have a finishing pass on this one because you will see the edge, and I just wanted to make sure that that was a little bit cleaner. So the finishing pass is pretty small, 0.013. Same speed though. 100, so 0.1 of an inch for maximum roughing step down. So that's how far it'll step down, slightly less than 1/8 of an inch. And a step over of 0.075. And that's enough to get through this. I think it's 3 passes. And then after that, it moves on to the other side. For the top panel, we do the cutout, and again, double-sided tape. So I just have it do the contour. Again, nothing special. I just use the same cutting speeds. And for my geometry, it's just the closed chain all the way around the bottom. A couple passes around that one, moves on to the other one, and it's done. So it's all in all, it's pretty quick. It says about 10 minutes of total machine time between the chamfer and the grooves. There's things that change bit changes. It doesn't really know that it's gonna not have rapids and do all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit higher than that, but it's not terrible. And then for the lids, the machining time, 3 minutes, 40 seconds, basically 4 minutes. It's pretty quick. And I do the sides, and then I do the top and bottom panels after that. So I've already got the 1/8 inch bit in place, so I don't really need to do a whole lot with that. And that is basically our model. This will be the lids. Basically going to be rabbited on all 4 sides, and then they just get glued in the box all at once, all together. This will use the same 1/8 inch roughing bit that I was using before. So that is basically our model, and yeah, and all we got to do after all that stuff is done is clean it up, put it together. I've got all of our parts here on the bench, so our top and bottom, with our clipped corners so that they don't have any issues on the inside of the box. All the insides of everything. I'll sand the outsides later, but the insides are a pain, so sand those first. I've got some square dowel that I have sanded down to 3/16 by 3/16, and that is what I cut these grooves on the corners for. I'm going to take it, put it in there, and mark it so that it is about the same distance as between those 2 pieces. We are getting close to getting everything all glued up here. One thing that is important to note, if you end up going with the rabbet here, the recess groove right through the middle. So what that ends up getting you is we'll go back in and we'll glue in another piece of wood into that groove because we'll cut the top off of it. So we're going to glue it all up as one big box, one closed box, and then we'll cut the top off of it. And then with that rabbet on the inside, well, it'll turn into a rabbet, that groove on the inside, we'll glue in some pieces here, and that allows us to put the lid on. Just like that. I made mine so that the top piece groove is going to end up being 3/4 of an inch, so it's 3/4 of an inch from there to here, and so somewhere probably around an inch is where I will cut it with the bandsaw. It might not even be a bad idea to take your pencil or some marking thing and then mark about where it is, because that way you don't forget, because you don't want to forget, and then all of a sudden you accidentally end up cutting not far enough down. Kind of make sure that everything is pushed down flat, nice and easy. And then I 3D printed these little brackets, and they're pretty simple. I'm pretty sure you can buy them or buy something like them. I'll put a link in the description. You can pick up the models for these. There's nothing special. They're going to be free. I'll just have them on my store, shop.mosquitomade.com. And then the inside is just a 90-degree V with a circle cut through the bottom of it. And the reason for that is then if the corner isn't perfect, I'm not trying to jam it into 2 things that aren't quite right. And so that just gives it a little bit of space. And then you throw some rubber bands on it. I like using rubber bands for glue ups because for boxes, especially like this, they're hard to beat. Great way to get all of these just kind of squeezed together with a little bit of force on everything. And then I try to wiggle this panel since it's free floating. I try to wiggle it so it's right in the middle. That way if there is any glue that's going to hold it until things start expanding and contracting, it'll be somewhat centered. An issue here where this piece is out a little bit on both sides and then this one is the same, so I'm going to grab a little bit of a clamp, give it a squeeze just to pull that together. All right, that's looking good. How's our top look? Pretty good. And then I'm just going to grab a mallet here, make sure everything is nicely on the bench. So then at least it'll be as flat as my bench is, and now we just leave it like that and let it dry. We're all out of the rubber band clamps and all that stuff, so I'm gonna get this all kind of cleaned up and sanded up. So if you've ever clamped miters, you might know that occasionally you get little gaps. These are actually all fairly good. This one may be a little bit of a gap, but really not bad. So that actually worked out pretty well. But have you ever heard the saying from welders that say, a grinder and paint will make you the welder you ain't? Well, if you have issues with your miters, you could do the philosophy of a screwdriver on the corner will make my miter gooder. So I'm just basically using this to burnish. So you kind of essentially just bend the corner over, and I usually give it a couple of passes on both sides and then right down the middle. And then once you sand that up, that has a tendency to help close up any of those little gaps that you might end up with. And even if they're not gaps, sometimes they just look like gaps because of like the glue and stuff that's in between it. And then that cleans things up really nicely. Just goes to show you, you don't have to be perfect at every step. Just be good at cleaning up the next one. Over here at the bandsaw, we are going to cut the top off of this thing. I had that little mark here that we had put in earlier so that I knew where the very top of my groove in the middle there was. And I've got the saw blade pretty much centered on an inch and an eighth. So we've got top and the bottom, and we can see that we've got that little rabbit on the inside here. And so we are just going to sand that a little bit to clean things up. I'm just knocking off these outside corners, and that'll give us a nice little look, I guess. I kind of like it. That way you don't have to get your box top perfect. So once we get that on there, you'll have that nice little intentional line right at the seam, which I like a lot more than trying to get it to be perfectly flush and then it doesn't line up perfect and it doesn't look quite right. I like intentional hiding of the gap through that little chamfer around the outside. I've got a handful of these cut out. They're a little bit too long. Mark these out and then cut them. And then just so we don't forget, we'll do A, and then B. Complete and total overkill. You could easily do this without actually using a miter saw, but I got it. And I like using hand tools, so I figure we'll offset our CNC electron killing with a little bit of calorie killing instead. It's a little bit too tall, so I'm gonna have to plane those down just a little bit once I get into it, but that should do quite nicely. Coming out of these clamps here, obviously that is too tall, but that's what I wanted. I cut those strips at about 7/8 of an inch, and what I needed was right around 3/4 of an inch. And so we've got a gap, but that is perfect because we will trim that down with your method of choosing. I am personally going to hand plane it, so we're gonna throw that in the vise and get that taken care of. Counting my strokes as I go through this just to try to get it as even as I can. Making progress. And now I'm gonna specifically start trying to get the middle of this till I kind of run out of cut, and then I'm gonna come back. Just because then I can make sure that I don't end up with a hump in the middle and have the lid rocking back and forth. So like here, I'm not really cutting anymore because I can't get down in there. And then I take the last few all the way across. And we are really, really close. And then I'm going to use my block sander to knock off the insides. Get everything all nice and smoothed out. And there we got it. Since I won't be there when these things are actually going to be put together and used, and I'm also not responsible for the transportation of them, I'm going to mark my end on both the lid and on the actual box itself. So I'm just wood burning. The reason I like to hang it off the bench like this is because then I can rest my hand on my bench, because my handwriting is terrible. Why make it worse? This will just help me ensure that if for some reason these boxes got separated or something happened and the lids popped off in transportation or whatever, it just gives me a way to let them know which lid goes with which box. I am using Real Milk Paint Co. wood wax, walnut oil, and carnauba wax mix. What I end up doing is basically just applying it to everything and then going back in the same order that I applied it. That way, as soon as I get done applying it to the lid, I go back to the main box and then just start buffing it off from there with a clean cloth. So that is our set of boxes. We've got 4 of them ready to go. I'm not sure, I may end up doing another one at some point here. I'm thinking I might try to do a larger one just because I got the files already set up. But as always, I appreciate those of you that stuck around, and I will catch you in the next one.